The first drops began just after dusk, a cold, insistent rain tapping at the warped windows of the Carter family's apartment. The world outside had shrunk to the circle of yellow light thrown by a single, flickering street lamp. Puddles already forming on the broken sidewalk. Distant thunder rumbling low and constant like a warning buried beneath the hum of the city. Inside, everything was smaller, quieter. Ellie Carter, all of 9 years old but feeling older, sat cross-legged on the worn rug. A stubby crayon clutched tight in her hand. She drew lines with careful purpose, red, blue, then yellow for Sammy's hair, even though her little sister's curls were more the color of old pennies than sunlight. Beside her, Sammy, 5, hummed a song with no words, her voice soft and absent, all her attention bent on Major, their German shepherd, who lay sprawled across both girls' legs, a silent, breathing wall between them and the shadows. The apartment was not much more than 2 small rooms patched together by hope and old caulk. The kitchen sink dripped into a cracked basin, a fridge rumbled its own unhappy song, and in the corner, a pile of laundry sat like a sleeping animal no one dared disturb. Ellie listened to her mother's footsteps moving back and forth. Megan Carter, her face drawn and hair pulled up tight, folding her waitress uniform one-handed while trying to smooth the ache in her chest with the other. Megan's eyes flicked to the clock on the stove, the numbers glowing 8:57 p.m., then to the battered phone on the counter, then back to her daughter's. Ellie saw the way her mother's jaw tightened whenever the phone buzzed, or whenever the wind made the door rattle in its frame. Derek's shadow lingered in every corner, even when he wasn't there. Ellie felt it, she always did, the way the air seemed to thicken when the sun went down, when the neighborhood grew restless, when the quiet turned sharp and nervous. Sammy didn't know to be afraid, not yet. She only knew that Major always stayed closer on nights like this, his tail curled tight against her side, his dark eyes fixed on the front door. The storm pressed harder. Thunder cracked. The lights flickered once, twice before holding. Megan moved quickly, packing her purse, shoving a note into her pocket. Numbers for emergencies, the landlord's cell, the number for Mrs. Baker down the hall. She knelt beside her daughters, the smell of coffee and cheap perfume clinging to her clothes. She tried to smile, but it was thin, like plastic stretched too tight. "I'll be back before morning," Megan said, voice low. "Ellie, you know the rules. Lock the door. Don't answer for anyone but me. Okay?" Ellie nodded, her fingers clenched around the crayon so hard it snapped. She felt the sharp sting in her palm but didn't say a word. Sammy yawned, already drifting. Her thumb pressed against Major's ear, tracing the soft edge in small circles. The dog didn't move, just flicked an ear, his whole body tense as wire. Megan kissed the crown of Ellie's head, then Sammy's, then pressed her lips to Major's head, just once, the way she always did, as if he was the only thing she truly trusted. A car door slammed outside, too close. Ellie's head jerked up. Megan's face blanched. She shoved her arms into her coat, whispered, "I love you," then slipped out the door. The lock clicked shut. Footsteps faded down the hall. The silence that followed was thick as soup. For a long while there was nothing but the sound of rain, the kitchen sink, the tick of the clock, and the quiet, nervous breathing of 2 girls and a dog. Ellie finished her drawing, sliding it under the couch, her private ritual, as if hiding something beautiful could make the world less ugly. She gathered Sammy and Major close and tried to pretend that tonight was no different than any other. She read aloud from a battered picture book, her voice steady though her hands shook. Sammy fell asleep, pressed against Major's side. her breathing slow and even, her fingers tangled in his fur. Ellie stayed awake, counting the minutes, the thunder, the flickers of headlights through the blinds. She didn't dare look at the front door, not even when the shadow moved beneath it, not even when the rattling started. The scrape of keys, the jangle of metal, the sharp, angry sigh that followed. Major's head lifted. He didn't bark. He didn't move, not at first, but his ears stood up, eyes narrowed, and a deep, low rumble rolled from his chest, a sound like a promise or a threat. The handle turned. Lightning crashed so close the window panes buzzed. Ellie pressed Sammy closer, heart thundering, breath caught somewhere between a prayer and a scream. The keys rattled again, louder this time. The door trembled in its frame. Major stood then, slow and deliberate, placing himself fully between the girls and the door. His growl deepened. Thunder rolled, rain battered the roof, and the whole world seemed to shrink to the span of that little living room. 2 sisters, a mother's absence, a dog's quiet vow. For one heartbeat, Ellie thought she could smell Derek's cologne, sharp and sour, slipping beneath the crack of the door. She clutched Sammy's hand, whispered, "Don't move," and watched as Major, the only steady thing she had ever known, faced the storm with his head high and his body trembling, but unyielding. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Closer, the front door shuddered as the key slid into the lock. Major's growl was the only sound that mattered now, a low, steady promise. Not tonight. Not if I can help it. And in that small, battered apartment, as the storm raged and the shadows lengthened, hope was a quiet thing, warm, alive, and waiting for morning. The storm outside found its answer in the storm within. The door jerked open not with ceremony, but violence, a shudder of wood against metal, a clatter of keys, a muttered curse. Derek's shape filled the doorway, big and restless, the kind of presence that sucked air from the room just by arriving. His boots tracked mud across the cracked linoleum. The collar of his jacket, wet and frayed, bristled around his jaw. The apartment's warmth shrank, squeezed tight between thunderclaps and the hard edge of his anger. He smelled of beer and wet tobacco. The door slammed shut behind him, sending a shiver through the walls. Ellie felt it in her teeth, a brittle ache. Sammy jerked awake, confused, blinking against the overhead light, her cheek marked with the faint impression of Major's fur. Derek's gaze slid across the living room, landing on the girls, then on Major, who stood unmoving, a silent, unblinking shield. The only thing that betrayed the dog's tension was the line of his body, muscles pulled tight as wire, tail rigid, hackles slightly raised. Derek dropped his bag on the floor. The thud echoed, too loud for such a small space. "What's this mess?" he barked, his voice already edged with impatience. No answer was safe. Ellie tucked Sammy tighter behind her. Sammy's cup, half full of apple juice, teetered on the end table, the plastic rim slippery with condensation. In the silence, it slipped, tipped, and fell. Juice splattered across the threadbare rug. Time snapped. Derek's face twisted. "Can't you do anything right?" His shout filled the room, bouncing off walls like thrown stones. Sammy whimpered, shrinking away. Derek crossed the space in 2 strides, his movements jagged with old rage and fresh drink. Ellie's heart froze. For a moment, her body forgot how to move, caught between instinct and terror. Derek's hand lashed out, not at her, but at Sammy, a backhanded slap, fast, too fast, landing with a sharp, fleshy crack. Sammy toppled sideways, her head striking the corner of the table with a dull, hollow sound. For a split second, the only thing that moved was the juice pooling beneath her. Major surged forward, a blur of fur and muscle. He planted himself between Derek and the girls, lips curled, teeth bared, a snarl rumbling from deep in his chest. The sound was primal, not wild but deliberate, a warning as old as wolves and storms. Derek, already red with fury, lifted a foot as if to kick, but Major didn't flinch. He held his ground, eyes locked on Derek's, every inch of his body screaming, no further. Sammy's cry was thin, high, then cut off. Blood trickled from her brow, a slow red line that glistened against her skin. Ellie's fear shattered into something sharp and bright. She lunged, gathering Sammy into her arms, hands slippery with blood and panic. Major's stance never wavered, though his body shook with the effort of restraint. Derek growled curses, pacing the small space like a caged animal. Uncertain now. Major's presence changing the calculus of anger and control. For a moment, Ellie saw the chance. The door half open behind Derek, the storm beyond it suddenly less frightening than the violence inside. She met Major's eyes. The dog's tail flicked once, barely a movement, but it was enough. Ellie pressed her palm to Sammy's bleeding head, whispered her name, "Stay with me, baby, just stay," and dragged her sister upright. Major backed alongside them, his body a wall, his eyes never leaving Derek. Another crash of thunder shook the windows. Derek lunged, but Major moved faster, snapping his jaws in the air, a controlled threat, herding the girls toward the door. Ellie shoved it open. The wind roared in, cold and alive, stinging her cheeks with rain. She half carried, half dragged Sammy into the night. Major slipped after them, his fur soaked in seconds, his presence the only warmth left. Behind them, Derek's voice thundered, but the rain swallowed it. The world outside a wild, howling blur of water and light. Ellie ran, breath burning in her lungs, legs numb from fear and cold. Sammy sagged in her arms, too quiet. Blood smeared across Ellie's shirt, warm and terrifying. Major led, forging a path through puddles and mud, his body always between them and the world behind. Lightning lit the street in jagged, blinding flashes. Shadows leapt and danced. The storm turned sidewalks into rivers, alleyways into black mazes. Ellie's sneakers slipped, her arms shaking with the weight of her sister and the weight of every night like this that came before. She didn't cry. There was no time. They reached the corner where the street lamp flickered. Major paused, ears scanning the darkness, body tense and alert. In the distance, sirens wailed, maybe real, maybe just the wind mimicking hope. Ellie clung to Sammy, rocking her gently. "Stay awake, please, Sammy, talk to me." Sammy's eyes fluttered. "It hurts." Her voice was a whisper. Major nuzzled her cheek, licking away the blood, his tongue gentle, eyes wild with worry. Ellie pressed her cheek to Sammy's hair, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Behind them, the apartment windows stayed dark. No help came. Rain washed away footprints almost as soon as they were made. But Major kept moving, guiding them down side streets, always looking back, always listening for pursuit. He was more than a dog tonight. He was a guardian, a compass, a last piece of hope in a world that had gone cold. Ellie stumbled, almost falling, but Major nudged her, steadying her step, his presence a silent command. "Keep going, don't stop, not yet." In that wild night, 3 fugitives from the only home they knew. Ellie looked at Major and understood, in her bones, that safety was not a place. but the distance they could put between themselves and Derek's rage. And so they ran, into the storm, into the dark, together. The rain kept falling. Major's eyes gleamed ahead, always searching for somewhere, anywhere, safe. Rain came down so hard it blurred the world to streaks of silver and black. Ellie's arms ached from carrying Sammy, who drifted in and out of a dazed, shivering silence, blood drying sticky on her forehead. Every step felt impossible, but the only thing more terrifying than going forward was looking back. Major moved beside them, always just close enough for Ellie to feel the brush of his soaked fur against her leg. Sometimes surging ahead, sometimes doubling back, nose low, body taut with purpose. Ellie had never felt so small in all her life. The streetlights blurring into halos, thunder rolling overhead, wind flinging trash and leaves in whirls around their feet. The city, which during the day bustled with familiar noise and routine, now felt wild and sharp, full of dangers she could neither see nor name. They passed empty bus stops, garbage cans knocked sideways, paper drifting down gutters like lost hopes. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lonely, uncertain sound swallowed by the rain. Ellie pressed on, her jaw clenched, fighting the sick, hollow ache in her stomach. Sammy clung to her, barely moving, her breathing short and uneven. The pain in Ellie's arms threatened to buckle her knees. She shifted Sammy's weight, but her sister whimpered, flinching at the touch. Ellie blinked rain from her eyes and whispered, "Just a little farther. Just hold on." It was a lie. She had no idea where they were going, only that they could not stop. Major halted at a flooded crosswalk, his body rigid. Ellie peered down the block, searching for any sign of Derek. Lightning flashed, illuminating broken glass on the sidewalk and the dark windows of shuttered storefronts. The city was asleep, but Ellie's heart hammered as if the whole world might wake at any moment. She tried to remember the way to the hospital. She had never gone there on her own, only riding the bus with her mother, watching the city pass by. Now every landmark seemed strange, slippery in the storm. A siren wailed somewhere far off, then faded. She took a step into the street, water rushing up around her ankles, Sammy's sneakers dragging along the curb. Major darted into the water ahead, barking once, a sharp, low sound that seemed to point the way. Ellie stumbled after him, her feet numb. Sammy's head lolled against her shoulder, her voice barely a sigh, cold. Ellie squeezed her tighter, almost losing her grip, almost slipping herself. "It's okay, we're going," she murmured, teeth chattering. Halfway across the street, the wind gusted so hard it nearly knocked them sideways. A piece of newspaper slapped against Ellie's leg, then tore free, vanishing into the night. Major circled them once, bumping Sammy's foot with his nose, then trotted on, his tail straight out behind him. His presence was more than comfort. It was a kind of anchor, keeping Ellie from drifting away entirely. On the far curb, a porch light flickered on, then off again. A figure peered from behind a curtain, watching, then vanishing. The world felt empty of help and full of eyes. Still, Ellie pressed forward, into alleyways and puddles, her shoes squelching, her breath sharp and shallow. A car swept past, spraying water, its headlights catching the fear in Ellie's face before it was gone again. No one stopped. No one rolled down a window to ask if they needed help. They reached a narrow lane that ran behind a row of small houses, all with their shades drawn tight. Major led them down it, sometimes pausing to sniff the air, always glancing back to make sure the girls followed. Ellie could barely see, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks, her arms trembling so violently she almost dropped Sammy more than once. The rain washed everything raw. Ellie tasted metal in her mouth, blood or fear, she couldn't tell. She began to mutter the old words her mother used on hard nights, words she barely remembered, half lullaby, half prayer. "Hold on, just a little more. Just a little more, baby." Major suddenly stopped, his ears up, body angled toward a flickering light on the next block. Ellie staggered to a halt, struggling for breath, and followed his gaze. Mrs. Baker's window glowed, a rectangle of gold in the darkness. Ellie's heart leapt. For one desperate moment, she thought of banging on the door, begging for help. But then she saw Mrs. Baker herself, standing behind the glass, her face pale and still. Their eyes met. Mrs. Baker didn't move. She didn't call out. Instead, she gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, a slow lowering and raising of her chin, as if to say, "Go on. Go. Get help." It was not refusal, but permission, a silent blessing for their escape. Major brushed Ellie's hip with his nose, urging her on. Ellie's legs felt as heavy as iron, but the sight of that nod gave her one last reserve of strength. She shifted Sammy higher, ignoring the pain in her arms, and followed Major as he ducked into a narrow cut between buildings, away from the light. The shortcut Major found was little more than a passage of mud and weeds, but it cut through to a wide avenue, and far ahead, the blue and white hospital sign glowed in the storm. Ellie sobbed once, almost losing her grip on Sammy. But Major pressed close to her side, shepherding them across the last stretch of rain-swept sidewalk. Sammy moaned, her head lolling, and Major nuzzled her cheek, licking away the tears and rain, keeping her awake. They stumbled up the last block, the hospital's sliding doors looming like the gate to another world. Ellie nearly collapsed, but Major barked, one sharp, desperate sound, and the light above the entrance flared brighter, calling them in. By the time they reached the hospital steps, Ellie could barely see, could barely breathe. Her arms were numb, her face burning with cold and terror and exhaustion. Sammy's eyes fluttered, but her hand tightened around Ellie's thumb, a final flicker of trust that held them both upright. Major stepped onto the mat, shaking himself, spraying water everywhere. Ellie followed, dragging Sammy, leaving a trail of blood and rain behind her. Inside, the harsh fluorescent lights and the sharp smell of disinfectant burned her nose and eyes. She hesitated on the threshold, paralyzed by shame, by fear that no one would believe them, that this was the end of the road and not a new beginning. But Major barked again, louder this time, urgent, pleading. At last, someone came running. And in that moment, under the harsh lights and the quiet hum of the hospital night, Ellie let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, they had outrun the darkness for one more night. The hospital was quieter than Ellie had imagined. Not silent. There were always voices somewhere, a cough or the drone of wheels on linoleum. But the stillness felt different here, heavy and almost holy, as if everything that mattered hovered just outside the reach of words. It was hours after midnight. Rain still streaked the windows. The storm's fury faded to a whisper now, but inside the storm lingered, folded into Ellie's bones. Nurses had taken Sammy from her arms, quick and gentle, murmuring words Ellie didn't remember. She'd stood there shaking, cold, rain-drenched, her shoes leaving prints on the clean floor. Major tried to follow as they wheeled Sammy away, but a nurse blocked his path. For a moment, Ellie was afraid Major would snarl or bolt, but instead he only sat beside her, his chest heaving, eyes tracking every movement as if he alone could keep the world from falling apart. They brought Ellie to a small room, 4 walls the color of oatmeal, a bed covered in a stiff blue blanket, a nightstand with nothing on it but a plastic cup of water. Major curled up beneath the window, his head on his paws, his fur still damp and heavy with the night's ordeal. He didn't sleep. Neither did Ellie. She lay on top of the covers, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe slow and quiet so the ache in her chest wouldn't spill over. Every now and then, someone came to check on her. A nurse with gentle eyes, a young man in green scrubs who brought her a blanket and a carton of juice. Each time they asked, "Is there anyone we can call for you?" Each time Ellie shook her head. She wasn't sure who could come, or if she even wanted them to. The waiting became its own kind of storm. No one said anything about Sammy except, "The doctors are taking care of her," or "She's being looked after." Ellie's questions went unanswered, hanging in the stale air between her and the clock on the wall. The hands crept forward. Outside, dawn began to bruise the sky with gray and purple. Ellie closed her eyes and tried to disappear, but every time she drifted, memories dragged her back. Derek's voice, Sammy's blood, the sharp tang of fear in her mouth. Major kept his vigil by the window. Once, a nurse paused in the doorway, eyeing him warily. "He's very well behaved," she said, half smiling. Ellie nodded, too tired to explain that Major wasn't just a dog. He was the one thing in her world that had never broken or left. At sunrise, the room filled with a thin, watery light. The city outside looked washed clean, but Ellie knew better. Rain only made the cracks shine brighter. She sat up, her limbs stiff, skin itching beneath borrowed hospital pajamas. Major stretched, yawning wide, the pink of his tongue a strange splash of color in the gray morning. A soft knock. The door opened, and a woman in a navy cardigan stepped inside, a clipboard held to her chest. Her hair was shot through with gray, eyes kind but careful. She looked at Ellie, then crouched to stroke Major's head, earning a slow tail thump. "My name's Mrs. Collins. I'm here to talk if you want." Ellie said nothing. She stared at the woman's shoes, plain black, soles worn at the edges. Mrs. Collins settled in the chair across from the bed. Not too close, not too far. She waited, hands folded, her presence gentle and solid. "Sammy's in good hands," Mrs. Collins said. "The doctors are going to stitch her up. She has a mild concussion, but she's a tough little thing. You did the right thing bringing her here." Ellie's jaw clenched. She pressed her palms into her eyes until stars danced behind her lids. Will she remember?" Mrs. Collins hesitated, then shook her head. "She might not remember tonight. That's not a bad thing." The room grew quiet again. Major shifted, sighing, his warm breath fogging the window. Ellie looked at her hands, at the faint smears of dried blood beneath her nails. She wanted to ask about her mother, if anyone had called, if anyone was coming, but the words would not come. Instead, she asked, "What happens now?" Mrs. Collins didn't answer right away. She glanced at Major, then at Ellie. "We wait, and when you're ready, you can tell us what happened. You're safe here, Ellie. That's what matters most right now." Safe. The word tasted strange, brittle, and uncertain. Safe had always been a moving target, never a place, always a pause between storms. Ellie looked at Major, who watched her with eyes older than any storm. He didn't need words to understand her fear. A police officer came later, a tall woman in a blue uniform who spoke softly, kneeling so her eyes were level with Ellie's. She asked about Derek, about her mother, about the night's rain. Ellie answered in pieces, words drifting out like broken twigs. She left things out, didn't mention the sharpness of Derek's voice or the way Major had stood guard through it all. Some things were too big, too tangled to fit into the spaces of someone else's questions. As the sun climbed, Mrs. Collins returned with oatmeal and apple slices. She coaxed Ellie to eat, watching as Major licked crumbs from the floor with careful, grateful dignity. Nurses peeked in, bringing new bandages for Sammy, soft blankets, gentle reassurances. But no one brought news of Megan. Her phone went unanswered. No one said the words home or family or forever. Late in the morning, as Ellie drifted toward sleep for the first time in days, she heard voices in the hall, a nurse's low murmur, the sharp click of shoes on tile, the crackle of a police radio. Major lifted his head, ears pricked. Ellie sat up, heart thudding. The door swung open. Mrs. Collins smiled softly. "Someone's here to see you." Ellie's hope leapt, then faltered, but it was not her mother. It was the social worker, a new officer, and behind them Mrs. Baker, her hair in curlers, her face pale but fierce. "I told them you were a fighter, child," Mrs. Baker said, squeezing Ellie's shoulder. "And you've got a good dog. Don't let anyone take him." Ellie felt something loosen in her chest, a single breath, deeper than she'd known she could draw. She reached for Major, burying her face in his fur, letting the silence settle. For the first time, she didn't have to hold the storm alone. Major, pressed close and breathing steady, reminded her, sometimes surviving was enough. Outside, the city shone, clean but unchanged, the world waiting for whatever came next. And in that small room, girl and dog lay side by side, the shape of hope not loud or bright, but quiet and real and warm. Ellie did not remember falling asleep, but when she woke, the sun had crawled higher. The light now poured across the floor in soft rectangles, making the world inside the hospital room feel oddly gentle, almost forgiving. Major had not moved from his post beneath the window. His tail thumped as soon as Ellie stirred, as if he'd been holding his breath for her. The night before played through her mind in shards. Rain on her face, Sammy's limp weight in her arms, the pulse of her own feet pounding the slick pavement. She remembered Mrs. Baker's nod, remembered the bright, cold hospital lights. But now the adrenaline was gone, and what was left was something slower and heavier, a kind of ache, like a bruise across her whole life. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, then slid off the edge of the bed. The linoleum was cold under her bare feet. A tray of untouched oatmeal sat on the nightstand, the apples already turning brown at the edges. Ellie reached for a slice, broke it in half, and passed the bigger piece to Major, who ate it with careful dignity. The hallway beyond her room bustled with quiet industry, nurses pushing carts, doctors murmuring outside closed doors, the squeak of sneakers and the whisper of papers shuffling. The hospital's routine was its own kind of comfort, indifferent to personal sorrow, but steady as the sunrise. A nurse entered, smiling gently, to tell Ellie that Sammy was awake and asking for her. The words nearly unraveled Ellie, but she kept her face blank, nodded, and let the nurse guide her down the hall. Major padded behind, his claws clicking a soft rhythm. As they passed the nurse's station, a police officer with tired eyes watched them go. Not unkind, just wary, already making notes in a slim black book. Sammy's room was smaller, dimmer. She lay in the bed, pale with a strip of white gauze above her brow. Her eyes brightened when she saw Ellie, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other, the world shrinking down to the bond that had survived everything so far. Ellie rushed to her side, careful not to jar the bed, her hands trembling as she brushed a strand of hair from Sammy's cheek. Major settled by the door, his presence a promise. "I'll watch. I'll keep you safe." Sammy reached for Ellie's hand, her voice a dry whisper. "Did the storm stop?" Ellie nodded. It stopped. She wanted to say more, wanted to promise safety, but the words knotted in her throat. Instead, she squeezed Sammy's fingers, tracing the lines of her palm, memorizing the proof that her sister was still here. "You're going to be okay," she managed. For a while, the girls sat in silence. Nurses came and went, checking Sammy's bandages, making quiet notes, leaving juice and crackers on the tray table. Major kept his distance, his nose twitching with each antiseptic sting, eyes never leaving the sisters. When Sammy dozed off again, Ellie bent to kiss her forehead, then returned to the hall. Mrs. Collins, the social worker, was waiting by the door. "You're a good sister, Ellie. You did everything right." Ellie looked away, staring at the pattern of the floor tiles. "I didn't want to run. We had to." "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is run," Mrs. Collins said. "Sometimes it's the only way to protect someone you love." They walked together back to Ellie's room. Major followed, brushing her hand with his nose as if to say he agreed. When they reached the door, Mrs. Collins hesitated. "The police will want to talk again," she said. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll stay with you if you want." Ellie nodded, numb and grateful all at once. Soon, a pair of detectives arrived. A man and a woman, both dressed in plain clothes, their faces tired but kind. They sat at the little round table, their notebooks open, pens ready. Major settled at Ellie's feet, one ear up, one ear down. They asked questions about Derek, about her mother, about the night before. Ellie answered slowly, piecing the night together from scattered memories and silences. She told them how Derek had come home angry, how Sammy had been hurt, how Major had stood between them and the worst of it. She didn't cry, not even when she spoke of the door, the rain, the way Major had led them through the dark. But her hands shook, and Major nudged her knee with his nose until she stilled. The detectives listened, sometimes glancing at each other, sometimes just nodding, scribbling quietly. When they finished, the woman detective closed her notebook and leaned forward, her voice gentle. "You're safe now. We're going to make sure of it." Ellie looked at Major, and something in her loosened. Not relief exactly. She wasn't sure what safety even felt like anymore. But a small knot inside her chest unraveled, making space for something new. Later, Mrs. Collins explained what would happen next. Social services, foster care, maybe a shelter, maybe a family. She spoke carefully, outlining the possibilities without making promises. "But Major stays with you," she said, her eyes firm. "We'll fight for that." Ellie nodded, clutching Major's collar, feeling the roughness of his fur beneath her palm. He was the only home she had now. As the sun set, painting the walls with amber and gold, Mrs. Baker returned, this time with a bag of clothes and a stubborn look on her face. "You'll stay with me for now," she announced. "The system's slow. Love shouldn't be." Ellie wanted to protest, But the word home was too tempting. She let herself believe it, just for a moment. That night, she and Major curled up together on a borrowed mattress in Mrs. Baker's guest room. The storm now only a memory. The house full of strange, kind silences. Ellie lay awake, one hand on Major's back, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his breath. She knew the hardest part was still ahead. The questions, the waiting, the not knowing. But for now, she was here. Sammy was safe. Major was warm and alive beside her. And for the first time in a long time, hope felt less like a risk and more like the beginning of something that could last. Dawn came slow to Mrs. Baker's house, arriving not as a flood, but a gentle seep, gray light pooling around the edges of curtains, warming the faded wallpaper, brushing the creased photographs above the mantel. Ellie woke tangled in the borrowed sheets, her cheek pressed against Major's shoulder. The old shepherd shifted as she stirred, his tail giving a single cautious thump. For the first time in days, Ellie felt warmth in her bones. The house was quiet. Not the sharp, breathless quiet of waiting for a storm, but a lived-in hush, the fridge humming, the floor creaking in the hallway, the soft shuffling of Mrs. Baker's slippers in the kitchen. Major licked Ellie's hand, then nosed the blanket aside, padding off to investigate the new world of smells and corners. Ellie dressed in the clothes Mrs. Baker had brought, soft from many washings, a little too big, but clean and comforting. She found Major sitting at the kitchen door, watching Mrs. Baker scramble eggs. Sunlight slanted across the linoleum, turning the world gold and gentle. Mrs. Baker slid eggs and toast onto a plate and set it before Ellie without a word, then filled a bowl for Major, who ate with polite restraint. "You eat," Mrs. Baker said. "You both need it." Ellie nodded, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. She ate in silence, the taste strange after days of running and fear. When she finished, Mrs. Baker poured her a cup of weak tea and sat across the table. Her hands were steady, her gaze clear but not pressing. She didn't ask questions, not yet. She only sat, a sturdy presence, as if her silence alone might knit the house together. Outside, the world moved on. A mail carrier whistled at the end of the drive. A neighbor's dog barked, answered by another 2 houses down. Ellie watched the light shift across the yard, tracing the edges of the unknown. Mrs. Baker finally spoke. "They'll come today," she said quietly. "Social services, police maybe. Someone always comes. Don't be afraid." She reached over and squeezed Ellie's hand, her grip warm and certain. "They'll try to make plans. That's their job. Ours is to tell the truth." Ellie nodded, though her stomach twisted. Major sat close, pressing his side against her leg, his breath slow and measured. Every now and then, he glanced toward the front door, as if to say, "Let them come. I'm here." Mid-morning brought the first visitor, a woman in a gray coat with a clipboard, her smile brisk and tired. She greeted Mrs. Baker by name and introduced herself as Ms. Avery, Child Welfare. Her eyes were gentle, but her questions were precise. She asked about last night, about the hospital, about Sammy. She asked what Ellie remembered, what she needed. Each answer felt like walking a rope over a canyon. Careful, deliberate, every word counted. Mrs. Baker listened, adding details where Ellie's memory faltered. She spoke quietly but with authority, her tone brooking no argument when Ms. Avery hesitated about the arrangement. "These girls have been through enough. They need each other. And that dog? He's earned his place. You'll have to fight me if you want him out." Ms. Avery took notes, her pen moving fast. She glanced at Major, who met her gaze with calm, measured dignity. "He seems very attached," she observed. "He's family," Ellie said. The words surprised her, but once spoken, they felt like truth. The conversation turned to practicalities. Forms to sign, appointments to schedule, calls to be made. Ms. Avery promised to update them on Sammy's recovery, to check in daily, to advocate for the girl's best interests. As she left, she paused at the door, looking back at Major. "I've seen a lot of dogs," she said. "Not many like him." Mrs. Baker just nodded, a private smile flickering at the corners of her mouth. Later, the police arrived. Detective Harris, the same kind woman from the hospital, her hair pulled back, her uniform neat. She knelt beside Major, letting him sniff her hand before turning her attention to Ellie. "You did good," she said softly. "You kept your sister safe. You listened to your dog. That matters." Ellie nodded, words feeling too big and clumsy for her mouth. Major stayed close, always between her and the door, always vigilant. After the questions, the signatures, and the promises, Mrs. Baker brewed coffee and set out sugar cookies left over from Sunday. Ellie ate one, savoring the sweetness, the way the crumbs melted on her tongue. For the first time in days, she let herself breathe, really breathe. As the afternoon faded, Mrs. Baker sat with Ellie in the living room, the air thick with the scent of old books and lemon polish. Sunbeams danced on the carpet, lighting the dust in the air. Major sprawled beside Ellie, one paw draped over her shoe. Mrs. Baker finally spoke, her voice low. "It's going to be hard for a while. Change always is, but you're safe here, both of you." Ellie looked at her, unsure how to answer. She felt the fear still, a low pulse in her chest, but it was softer now, diluted by the presence of warmth and safety. She reached for Major's ear, rubbing the rough fur between her fingers. In the quiet, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world could hold both pain and safety. That kindness, given time, might find its way through even the thickest storm. That night, Ellie lay awake. Major curled against her back, Mrs. Baker's soft footsteps moving past her door. She heard the old woman humming to herself in the hallway, a tune with no words, only hope. In the darkness, Ellie pressed her cheek to Major's head, listening to his slow, even breath. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but inside she was warm, safe. Not whole, not yet, but mending. And for the first time, sleep came not as escape, but as shelter. The days that followed blurred together, not because nothing happened, but because so much did all at once in ways that didn't make noise. There were no more storms, but there were questions, visits, and the slow, unfamiliar work of learning how to be safe again. Sammy came home from the hospital with a stitched brow, her smile quick to return, but her sleep uneasy. She clung to Ellie with a quiet fierceness, never out of reach for long. And wherever Sammy went, Major followed. The big dog moved between sisters and strangers, shadowing them through every new room and ritual, always watchful, always steady. Mrs. Baker's house filled with small, careful routines. Breakfast came early, with eggs and buttered toast and cocoa in chipped mugs. Ellie learned where the extra towels were kept, how to fold laundry the way Mrs. Baker liked, how to help Sammy brush her hair so the scab didn't catch on the bristles. There was comfort in these small things. The making of beds, the laying out of pajamas, the smell of lemon soap in the bathroom. Each day was another stone in the bridge they were building out of fear. Social workers came and went, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs. They brought forms to fill, questions to answer, checklists to complete. Sammy played with her blocks under the dining room table while Ellie sat on the edge of the couch, Major's head on her knee, answering softly. Yes. She was eating. Yes, she slept in her own bed. Yes, Mrs. Baker was kind. Yes, she missed her mother. Each answer seemed to matter, even the ones she didn't say aloud. Some afternoons, Mrs. Baker walked them to the small park at the end of the street. Major trotting beside the girls, leash loose but never slack. The world outside was still sharp. Children's laughter in the playground rang loud, and parents sometimes stared too long. But Major's presence made a path for them, his body a shield that never needed words. Ellie watched Sammy climb the lowest rung of the slide, her stitches hidden beneath her bangs. At first, every squeal or tumble made Ellie tense, waiting for the kind of danger that used to follow them home. But the dangers now were ordinary. Scraped knees, bees in the clover, a swing-set chain that pinched small fingers. Ellie almost didn't trust it. Major patrolled the edge of the playground, circling back to check on Ellie, then Sammy, then Mrs. Baker knitting quietly on a bench. He never barked. He never chased. He simply stayed, an anchor reminding the world that the girls were not alone. At night, Ellie lay awake listening to the house settle. Pipes ticking, wind pressing against the windows, the faint hum of Mrs. Baker's radio in the kitchen. Some nights, she heard Sammy whimper in her sleep and slipped into her room, curling up beside her until the dreams faded. Major stretched out at the foot of the bed, his sigh deep and certain. As if to say, "I'm here. Nothing gets past me." There were court dates looming, talk of hearings and decisions that would be made in offices far away. Mrs. Baker sat at the table with a folder of papers, frowning at fine print, the corded veins in her hands standing out. Ellie watched her, wondering if love could ever be strong enough to change the way the world was run. One afternoon, as rain tapped lightly at the window panes, Mrs. Baker called Ellie into the living room. "They're going to ask hard questions soon," she said quietly, her voice more tired than Ellie had ever heard. "About your mother, about Derek, maybe about me. You don't have to say anything you don't want. You tell the truth you need to tell." Ellie nodded, biting her lip. She wanted to ask if they'd ever go home again, if her mother would ever call, if the life they'd left behind was lost forever. But the words tangled in her throat. She looked down at Major, who met her gaze and nudged her hand with his nose. That night, as dusk fell, Mrs. Baker made soup and set out extra spoons, though it was only the three of them. She hummed as she worked, the same wordless tune Ellie had heard in the dark. After dinner, the girls sat in the living room, coloring quietly at the coffee table while Mrs. Baker read the newspaper and Major stretched out on the rug. The phone rang. Mrs. Baker answered, voice low and measured, her back to the room. The conversation was short. When she hung up, her hands trembled just slightly. She came back and sat on the sofa, gathering the girls close with an arm around each of them. "Things will change soon," she said. "But we'll face it together. All of us." Later, as the house settled and the girls prepared for bed, Ellie lingered in the hallway, listening to the familiar sounds. Water running, Major's nails tapping on the kitchen tile, Mrs. Baker closing cupboards. She realized that home was not a place you ran back to. Sometimes, home was the place you built from what was left. In the small hours, Ellie found herself awake, moonlight spilling through the window. She slid out of bed, padded down the hall, and found Major waiting for her by the back door. She sat with him on the cool floor, her hand resting on his broad head. "Are you scared too?" she whispered. Major pressed closer, warm and steady, answering with silence and the slow, deep rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the world was still uncertain, but in this house, in this moment, quiet was enough. And for now, that was all the girls needed. Spring came, slow and shy, finding its way into the corners of Mrs. Baker's house one petal at a time. The chill retreated. Sunlight slid over the kitchen table, lighting up the chipped mugs, making the dust on the floorboards look like stars. Every day the world outside seemed a little more possible. And every day the girls tested it, step by tentative step. Ellie and Sammy started at the local elementary school. Sammy in the half-day kindergarten, Ellie in Mrs. Goldstein's 4th grade. The school was only 3 blocks away, an easy walk under budding trees. But that first morning, the air pressed heavy with memory. Ellie held Sammy's hand too tight. She scanned each parked car, each grown-up's face. Major walked them there, leash clipped but slack, fur bright in the new sun. He waited outside the gate, his eyes following them all the way to the double doors, not budging until Ellie turned and waved, a small, certain sign. "I'm all right, I see you, I'm not lost." Inside, the halls were strange, smelled of new books and pencil shavings, of lunch meat and floor wax. Kids looked, some whispered, but most turned away quickly, already drawn back into their own small worlds. Ellie sat in the back, eyes on the clock. When the bell rang, her heart leapt to find Sammy at the fence, Mrs. Baker at the corner, and Major sitting, regal and patient, tail thumping softly on the grass. It became routine. School, home, homework at the kitchen table, Mrs. Baker humming while she chopped onions for soup, Sammy coloring pictures of dogs and houses, always with 3 figures and a 4th, shaggy and smiling. Major learned the timing of the day, waiting under the window for the bus, listening for footsteps. On the nights when nightmares found Sammy, Major climbed onto her bed, curling his warm weight around her feet until she settled. Yet for all that was new, old fears never vanished entirely. Sometimes, walking past an alley, Ellie would freeze at the sight of a man's shadow or the sound of boots on concrete. Sometimes, Sammy would flinch at the sharp clatter of a pan or the sound of raised voices through an open window. Even Mrs. Baker, for all her steel, watched the mailbox with a certain set to her jaw whenever the postman came late. One afternoon, a car pulled to the curb as Ellie and Sammy waited with Major outside the school gate. It was a gray sedan, windows up, idling longer than usual. Ellie's breath caught. Her body remembered before her mind did. Derek's old car, the way he'd circled the block before coming home, the shape of his hand on the wheel. She pressed Sammy closer, fingers tightening on Major's collar. Major stood, slow and deliberate, placing himself between the girls and the curb. The car rolled down its window. A woman's voice called out, a teacher from the next grade asking for directions. Ellie's shoulders dropped. She smiled, small and shaky. The danger dissolved, but her heart still raced long after the car pulled away. At home, Ellie found Mrs. Baker in the garden, pruning the rosebush. She knelt beside her, fingers digging into the dirt. "Will it ever stop?" Ellie asked. Barely more than a whisper. Mrs. Baker didn't look up. "What, child? Being scared of things that aren't there anymore?" Mrs. Baker snipped a thorny branch, set it aside. "Maybe not. Maybe you just get better at knowing which fears are worth listening to. She brushed her dirt-smudged hand over Ellie's. It's not weakness, honey. It's just your heart learning its way again. Ellie nodded. She leaned into the old woman's shoulder. Let herself be still. The seasons turned. Days stacking up like dominoes. Letters from the court arrived, full of words Ellie only half understood. Custody, supervision, parental rights. There were visits from social workers, counselors, even her mother, Megan, once, standing on Mrs. Baker's porch, eyes hollow, voice trembling as she promised she was getting better, was looking for work, would call soon. The girls sat beside Major in the hallway, listening, but neither of them ran to her. Not yet. The future came at them in quiet increments. There were good days. Sammy laughing in the park, Mrs. Baker reading aloud from the newspaper, Ellie winning a spelling bee, Major basking in a patch of sunlight on the rug. There were hard days, nights when sleep came fitful, when old names rose in dreams, when the mail brought letters in cold, official envelopes. But through it all, Major remained, a constant, silent companion, a bridge between what hurt and what healed. He walked the girls to school, watched the windows when strangers passed, guarded the stairs at night. Sometimes, when Ellie woke in the small hours, she found him already sitting at the edge of her bed, looking at her with those dark, steady eyes that promised, I know the world is big and sharp, but I am here. One Saturday, as rain fell soft and forgiving, Mrs. Baker set out soup and bread, and the girls curled together on the couch. Sammy traced her finger over the ridges of Major's scarred ear. He's like us, she said simply. He's been hurt, but he's still good. Ellie felt something inside her ease, like a knot finally starting to loosen. And in that gentle room, with the scent of soup and the warmth of the dog pressed close, the girls let themselves believe that maybe, just maybe, love was something you learned by staying. That the past was real, but the future could still grow, slow and green, around the edges of old fears. Major sighed, shifting his head into Sammy's lap. Ellie smiled, reaching out to touch his fur. For the first time, she realized she wasn't waiting for the world to be perfect. She was only waiting for it to be enough. There are places in every life where the road bends, where the shadows that once seemed endless finally thin. For Ellie, that season arrived almost without her noticing. The world beyond Mrs. Baker's porch grew softer. Rain became a background lull, not a threat, and even the quietest rooms no longer felt like traps. The weeks unfolded in slow, steady increments. Sammy's wound healed, leaving only a faint line beneath her hair. The school days, once edged with fear, slipped into a pattern. Homework, laughter at lunch, art projects tacked to the fridge. Ellie's handwriting improved. Her voice grew steadier in class. Sometimes she caught herself humming, the tune echoing the one Mrs. Baker used in the kitchen, the melody a thread running through their days. There were still hard moments. Ellie never forgot the sharpness of old fears, but she learned to breathe through them. She walked the long way around certain alleys, paused at the corner before crossing, and always looked for Major's shadow moving at her side. On the rare days when Derek's name was mentioned, by teachers, by neighbors, in the dull bureaucracy of letters, Ellie felt the old ice return. But now it melted faster, washed away by the rhythms of ordinary life. Sammy thrived under Mrs. Baker's care. She made friends at school, 2 girls, Harper and Mina, who liked to draw horses and tell jokes about aliens. Their laughter filled the playground, and their secrets spilled into sleepovers at Mrs. Baker's, where Major would curl himself under the blanket fort, eyes half closed but alert. Major changed, too, though in ways that only Ellie seemed to notice. He napped more often in the sunlight, his ears flicking at the smallest sound. He limped sometimes on rainy days, an old ache returning. Yet every morning, he waited by the front door, tail sweeping slow arcs, ready to walk the girls to school. He became a part of the neighborhood, a gentle king, known to mail carriers and neighbors alike, always greeted with a scratch behind the ear or a soft word. One Sunday, Mrs. Baker took the girls and Major to the big park by the river. The sky was wide and blue, the grass soft and high. Sammy ran ahead, chasing after dandelion fluff, Major trotting behind. Ellie watched them, the sunlight warming her shoulders, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel simple happiness. Nothing earned, nothing owed, just the quiet miracle of this day. Mrs. Baker joined her on the bench. She watched the girls, then placed her hand over Ellie's. "It's all right, you know, to let yourself be happy," she said, her voice as soft as the breeze. "You don't have to keep paying for someone else's mistakes." Ellie didn't answer, not right away. She let the words settle, sinking deep where the fear had once lived. Then she nodded, blinking against the sudden sting in her eyes. The world was changing. The caseworker visits grew less frequent. Letters from the court now spoke of permanency, of new beginnings. One morning, Megan came, clean, thinner, her voice uncertain but sober. She sat with the girls and Mrs. Baker on the front steps. She apologized, her hands twisting in her lap. She talked about finding a new job, about wanting to get better, about missing them every day. Ellie listened, Sammy silent beside her, Major pressed between them, breathing slow. That evening, Mrs. Baker sat with Ellie at the kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs. "Your mother's trying," she said. "That counts for something, but it's not all that matters. You get to choose what's best for you now." Ellie stared into her mug, seeing herself reflected in the swirl of tea. For the first time, she realized the future was not something she had to wait for. It was something she could shape, slowly, carefully, one small decision at a time. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in, heavy and loud. Ellie woke to the flash of lightning and the old, familiar fear twisting in her chest. But when she reached for Major, he was already there, pressed against her back, his steady breath a lullaby against the storm. She listened, counting the seconds between thunder and lightning, waiting for fear to overwhelm her. It didn't. Instead, she found herself whispering the old tune, the one Mrs. Baker hummed, the melody rising above the rain. Sammy slept on, untroubled. The house felt strong, the walls thick against the wind. Weeks passed. The court date approached, a hearing that would decide, at last, if Ellie and Sammy would stay with Mrs. Baker, or return to their mother, or be sent somewhere else. The night before, Mrs. Baker sat at the end of Ellie's bed, her hand gentle on Ellie's hair. "No matter what they decide, you're not alone," she said. "Family isn't a place. It's the people who show up for you again and again." The next morning, they dressed in borrowed Sunday clothes. Sammy braided Ellie's hair. Ellie buttoned Sammy's dress. Major watched, solemn and silent, as if understanding the importance of this day. The courtroom was bright and cold, the judge's face kind but distant. Lawyers spoke, Megan spoke, Mrs. Baker spoke, and finally Ellie spoke. She told the truth, not just the hard parts, but the quiet, shining parts, too. She spoke of her sister, of Mrs. Baker, of Major, of what it meant to feel safe. The judge listened. The decision was read aloud, words echoing in the still air. That afternoon, they returned to Mrs. Baker's house, no longer as guests, but as family. Sammy danced in the hallway. Major barked. Mrs. Baker wept in the kitchen, her tears brighter than any rain. Ellie stood in the middle of the living room, sunlight pouring across her face, and felt the last of the old shadows slip away. In the garden, daffodils bent in the breeze, and the air was full of the quiet promise of something lasting. Major lay in the grass, eyes half closed, tail thumping. Ellie sat beside him, her hand on his back. The world was still imperfect, and always would be. But here now, beneath this roof, there was space for hope to take root, stubborn and bright, in the places where fear used to live. Summer drifted in with its long afternoons and the smell of fresh-cut grass. Mrs. Baker's porch overflowed with petunias. Windows were always open, letting in birdsong, laughter, the low hum of bees. By now, Sammy's scar had faded to a thin pink line, nearly invisible under her new bangs, and Ellie's hair had grown out, curling at the ends, wild and sun-bleached. Their shoes lined up neatly by the door beside Major's leash, a silent promise that everyone belonged. The world had not become easier, only kinder. School ended with crayon-bright report cards and hand-drawn cards for Mrs. Baker, with thank you scribbled in looping letters. Sammy brought home a construction paper medal for bravery. Ellie folded hers into a bookmark for the library books she now read aloud to her sister on lazy afternoons. Major listened to every story, head resting on crossed paws, eyes half shut in the sun. The rhythms of safety grew thick and ordinary. Breakfast together, chores divided by laughter. Mrs. Baker teaching the girls how to knead bread or shell peas in the backyard. Some evenings, they all sat on the porch, watching thunderclouds roll over the trees, Mrs. Baker humming her same wordless tune. Major would rest his chin on Ellie's knee and watch the changing sky. Yet time, for all its gifts, never fully erased the past. Sometimes Sammy would startle awake from a dream, reaching for Ellie's hand in the dark. Sometimes Ellie caught herself scanning crowds for a familiar threat, heart pounding with a memory she could not name. Sometimes Mrs. Baker would pause in the kitchen, hands still, her eyes far away. Even Major had his hard days, a limp that grew worse after too much running, a morning when he didn't chase the mailman, just watched, quiet, from the cool shade. One August afternoon, a letter arrived, stamped from a new address. Megan's handwriting was careful and slow. She wrote about work, about missing the girls, about hoping they would write back if they wanted. There was no promise, only a kind of apology, gentle and uncertain. Mrs. Baker read the letter aloud, voice trembling. When she finished, Ellie tucked it into a shoebox of small treasures, photos, found feathers, a faded collar from a different life. She didn't know what to write back, not yet. Sometimes love returned quietly, needing time to grow. The days ran together. The pain dulled, but gratitude remained sharp. Ellie noticed everything. The way sunlight lingered in Mrs. Baker's hair as she watered the porch flowers. The gentle strength in her hands. The way Sammy giggled as Major licked her face. The way Major lay now, a little slower, a little grayer, but always there. His eyes meeting hers with an understanding that needed no words. One evening, after supper, Mrs. Baker suggested a walk to the edge of the fields. The air was cool and sweet, fireflies already blinking in the tall grass. Sammy danced ahead, chasing the flickering lights, while Ellie and Mrs. Baker walked side by side. Major trotted slowly, pausing to sniff the ground, to look back at them, to wait for Sammy. Mrs. Baker stopped, watching the sun sink low. "You remember how scared you were that first night?" she said quietly. Ellie nodded. "Sometimes I still am." Mrs. Baker took her hand. "Bravery isn't about being unafraid, Ellie. It's about staying, loving, and trying anyway, even when you're tired, even when it hurts." Ellie squeezed her hand, feeling the truth in the old woman's words. I think Major knew that before any of us. They watched as Sammy ran to Major, arms flung around his neck. He stood still, leaning into her hug, the golden light catching the silver on his muzzle. For a long moment, the world held its breath. The walk home was slow. Major lagged behind, his limp more pronounced. At the porch, Ellie knelt and pressed her face into his fur. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked at her, eyes deep and steady, then rested his head in her lap. Sammy curled beside him, humming the old tune Mrs. Baker always sang. Later, with the girls tucked into bed and Mrs. Baker's house quiet around them, Major curled into his favorite spot at the end of Ellie's bed. Ellie couldn't sleep, so she lay with her hand on his back, feeling his breath slow and steady. She listened to the night sounds, the far-off song of crickets, the creak of the porch swing, the distant call of a nightbird. In the darkness, she spoke to Major the words she'd carried all year. "You saved us, not just from that night, from being alone, from forgetting how to love." Major thumped his tail once, eyes closing, his chest rising and falling with each breath. In the morning, he was slower to rise, but when Sammy called his name, he followed her into the yard. The sun was already bright, dew sparkling on the grass. The girls played while Mrs. Baker made pancakes, the smell of butter and syrup drifting through the screen door. That afternoon, Ellie sat with Mrs. Baker in the shade, Major sprawled between them. Mrs. Baker read from a letter she'd written but never sent, about forgiveness, about the ache and the gift of second chances. She folded it carefully, pressed it into Ellie's hands. "Keep this," she said. "There will be days when you need reminding." As summer waned, time slowed again, meals shared, chores finished, stories read. The girls learned to ride their bikes down the gravel drive, to sew on buttons, to trust the shape of ordinary days. Major watched over them all, aging but undiminished in spirit, a thread of memory binding old pain to new hope. Years later, long after the last court date, after Sammy's hair had darkened and Ellie had grown taller than Mrs. Baker, after Major was gone and buried beneath the apple tree, Ellie would look back on these days as the beginning of her truest life. She would remember not the terror, not even the rescue, but the soft weight of forgiveness and the quiet daily courage of staying. If she ever found words for what remained, she would tell this: bravery is not the absence of fear, but the faith to build a home from broken things. Kindness is a light left burning even when you're tired, and love, real love, sometimes arrives on 4 paws, lies down beside you in the dark, and waits for your heart to heal, no matter how long it takes.